It happened in a blur, just a random accident, nothing more than a momentary lapse in focus. I dropped my favorite mug, the one I had bought on our first trip to Paris. It hit the floor with a deafening crash, shards scattering in all directions, the sound echoing through the silence of the apartment. For a split second, I froze, staring at the mess, the pieces of porcelain scattered like a broken puzzle that would never fit together again. But that wasn't the only thing that shattered. In that instant, something inside me clicked. I had been avoiding it for so long, telling myself it was just a phase, that we'd work through it, that this was just another rough patch. But now, looking at the broken mug, it hit me. Everything between me and John had already cracked beyond repair. It wasn't just the mug. It was our relationship, our lives together. The cracks had been forming for months, maybe even years, and I had been too blind or too scared to see it. I looked up, my eyes catching John as he stood by the window, staring out into the bleak New York skyline. He didn't even flinch at the noise of the mug breaking. He had stopped reacting to the things that used to matter. I could feel the distance between us now, sharper than ever. He was physically present, but emotionally? He had already checked out long before I even realized it. I wanted to say something, to confront him about the silence that had stretched between us like a chasm, but the words felt too heavy. It was as if saying them would make everything real, and I wasn't ready to accept that yet. He turned around, catching my eye for the briefest moment, before quickly looking away. It stung more than it should have. "I'll clean it up," I murmured, my voice sounding distant even to myself. John didn't reply. He never did anymore. I moved to gather the pieces of the mug, each sharp shard a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. My hands trembled as I scooped them into a dustpan, my mind swirling with the realization that I no longer recognized the person I had been when we first moved into this apartment. I wasn't the same person I had been when I made plans for a life with him, and somehow, neither was he. The evening stretched on, painfully slow. I was still on the floor, picking up the last of the pieces from the broken mug, but now the apartment felt suffocating, a hollow shell of what it had once been. The familiar, comforting clutter that had once been our home now looked foreign and abandoned. I caught sight of the photograph on the wall, the one of us laughing in front of the Brooklyn Bridge, so full of hope, so full of promise. That person in the photo? She felt like someone else entirely. As I swept the final shards into the dustpan, I realized how much had changed, how much I had changed. The apartment wasn't the only thing that had been worn down by time. I had spent so much energy holding on to something that was already gone, pretending that the cracks between us could somehow be filled. But what about me? What had I become? I stood up, dustpan in hand, and looked around. The walls seemed to close in on me, the once welcoming space now a reminder of everything I had lost. The color of the walls had faded, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the windows now muted. But it wasn't just the apartment that had changed, it was me. I no longer felt like the woman who had moved in here full of excitement and possibility. I had become small, cautious, a shadow of who I used to be. I had stopped believing in love. I had stopped believing in the future we'd once dreamed of. And worse, I wasn't sure who I was anymore outside of him. Outside of the routine we had settled into, of the late-night silences and the hollow conversations. I had become a version of myself that I didn't recognize. I tossed the dustpan into the trash, my eyes lingering on the remnants of our life together scattered on the floor. But the deeper pain was harder to see. It wasn't the mess I had to clean up, but the fact that I had stopped caring about it. There was no real anger, no frustration anymore. There was just resignation. A quiet, suffocating resignation. I walked to the window, looking out at the same skyline John had been staring at moments ago, but now it felt cold, distant. The city lights twinkled far below, but they seemed like they belonged to someone else, a life I wasn't part of anymore. I didn't know where I was headed, but it felt like a long, dark road, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't sure I even wanted to find my way out. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of everything that had gone unsaid, the suffocating quiet that filled the space between John and me. I could hear him breathing softly beside me, his back turned, facing the far edge of the bed. We hadn't slept facing each other in months. There was no more comfort in that space. The silence had grown so thick that it felt like a wall between us, a constant reminder of how far apart we had drifted. I couldn't sleep. The ticking of the clock on the wall felt louder than usual, almost mocking me with its steady, relentless rhythm. I tossed and turned, replaying everything in my mind. The way he had become distant, the way his once warm gaze now felt like it was looking right through me. Why hadn't I noticed it sooner? Why had I kept telling myself that it was just a phase, that it would pass? Every inch of my mind screamed with a single question: how did we get here? His footsteps from the kitchen echoed through the apartment, the sound of him getting ready for another long day of work. He barely acknowledged me when he walked by. He didn't even ask how I was doing, didn't look at me with concern, the way he once had. I could feel him withdrawing more and more, like a thread unraveling from the fabric of our life. But worse was the growing fear that gripped my chest. The fear of change, of facing the truth that we had outgrown each other, that what we had was gone. I didn't know how to fix it anymore. And deep down, a gnawing feeling told me that maybe I didn't want to fix it. Maybe I was terrified that if I tried to, I'd lose myself completely. What if he really was gone? What if this was the end? The thought was terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff and knowing that there was no way back. If I admitted it, if I faced the reality that we had come to this point, what would that mean for me? What would it mean for the life I thought we had built together? I wasn't ready to give it all up, but I didn't know how to keep going in this empty space with him either. I tried to tell myself that everything could still be fixed, that maybe we just needed to talk, maybe I could still reach him. But the doubt kept creeping in, the fear of pushing him further away, the fear of facing the part of me that wanted more, that wanted something real again, something that wasn't just surviving. The next morning, after John left for work, I sat in the quiet of the apartment, sipping my coffee. The space felt empty, like the remnants of a life that no longer made sense. I absent-mindedly scrolled through my phone, trying to distract myself. That's when I saw a message from Rick. "Hey, it's been a while. Want to grab coffee?" Rick. A name that stirred old memories. Good memories. I hadn't seen him in years, but his message felt like a lifeline. We had shared so much in the past, laughs, talks, unspoken connections. It had always been simple, uncomplicated. But now, I realized how much I missed those days, when life felt lighter, when I wasn't drowning in silence. I hesitated but then typed back, "Sure, let's meet. Same place?" A few hours later, we met at the cafe in Soho, the one we'd always gone to. It felt strangely familiar, yet foreign. Rick was already there, and when he looked up and smiled, something inside me stirred. His presence was comforting but also unsettling. We talked about the old days, about what had changed, but there was a quiet tension beneath it all. His gaze lingered on me longer than it should have, and I could feel the old connection sparking between us. Then, without warning, his hand brushed mine. I didn't pull away, and before I knew it, we were kissing. The moment was like a forgotten piece of myself coming back to life, but it was also a jarring reminder of how much had shifted in my life, how much I had changed, and how far I had fallen. We pulled away, and for a brief moment everything was still. The cafe's noise faded into the background, and I was left with the rushing sound of my heartbeat in my ears. Rick's eyes searched mine, unsure but hopeful. I wasn't sure what I was feeling anymore: surprise, guilt, longing. It all tangled together in a mess that made my chest tighten. I quickly looked down at the table, at the cup of coffee that was now cold and forgotten, and I felt a wave of embarrassment wash over me. What had I just done? This wasn't supposed to happen. We hadn't crossed that line before, Rick and I. We had always kept our friendship simple, uncomplicated. But now, sitting across from him, it felt like everything had shifted. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't prepared for, something dangerous. It was a kiss. but it felt like a doorway, leading me somewhere I wasn't sure I wanted to go. "I'm sorry," I murmured, almost instinctively, but the words didn't feel real. I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for kissing him, or for the way my heart had skipped when we did. Rick didn't say anything at first. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he leaned back slightly in his chair, a small, wistful smile tugging at his lips. "It's okay," he said, his voice softer than I expected. "But we both know this is more than just a kiss, don't we?" I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. It was more than just a kiss. It was a crack in my carefully constructed walls, a reminder of what I had been missing. But it was also a boundary I had just crossed, and I couldn't ignore the way it made my skin burn with both excitement and fear. I didn't know what I wanted anymore. The more I tried to push the feelings away, the stronger they grew, and I knew this was only the beginning of something I wasn't ready to face. I left the cafe in a daze, my mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Rick's presence lingered with me like a shadow, his words echoing in my head. This is more than just a kiss. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just let something dangerous into my life, something that had the potential to destroy whatever was left of the fragile foundation I had with John. I didn't know what I was looking for when I kissed Rick. Maybe it was comfort. Maybe it was a desperate attempt to feel something real again, to feel like the person I used to be. But now I couldn't deny the guilt gnawing at me. John hadn't even noticed the slow collapse of our relationship. How could I expect him to notice the chaos in me, the anger, the sadness, the hollow ache that I had been ignoring for too long? But this was a betrayal. When I walked through the door of our apartment, the weight of it all hit me. John was sitting on the couch, his eyes glued to the screen of his phone. I stood there, frozen for a moment, just watching him. The distance between us had never been more tangible. It wasn't just the silence, it was the way he didn't even look up when I entered. It was like I was a ghost in the room. I wasn't sure if I was more angry at him for being so oblivious, or at myself for being so complicit in this quiet, suffocating drift. "Hey," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, blinking as if he had been startled out of some distant thought. "Hey," he replied, as if it was the most normal thing in the world. There was no warmth in his voice, just the same indifference I'd grown used to. The walls between us had only grown thicker, and I realized that even though I had just come back from a kiss that meant everything, he wouldn't notice the change in me. He never did. I didn't know what I was expecting, what I was hoping for. I just knew that whatever it wasn't there. The silence stretched between us, so heavy I could hardly breathe. And yet, in that silence, I felt the truth settle over me. We had been living in a lie, pretending that things were okay, when deep down we both knew we were slowly slipping away from each other. I sat down, my fingers trembling. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do next. I could feel the guilt from my afternoon with Rick seeping into my every thought. But I also knew one thing. This wasn't just about the kiss. It was about everything that had gone unsaid for far too long. It was about the person I had become and the one I had to face now. I had to stop hiding from the truth. "You haven't said much lately." I finally broke the silence, my voice shaking with an emotion I couldn't name. "What's going on, John?" He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sigh, he shrugged. "I don't know. Just tired. Work, you know." But his words felt empty, like a placeholder for something more. The truth was right there, buried beneath layers of avoidance and half-truths. We had stopped trying to figure out what was wrong a long time ago. I could feel the weight of everything pressing in on me, and I realized that I was the one who had to confront it. I was the one who had to face the mess I had made, both with Rick and with John. The guilt from the kiss was only part of the picture. It was the bigger lie that I had been living that needed to be acknowledged. I looked at John, but I didn't know how to explain what I had done, or even what I had become. The silence between us felt insurmountable, but it was my fault. I had let it go on for too long, had let it fester, until everything was broken beyond repair. The night stretched on, heavy and oppressive, as I sat in the same place staring at John. The air between us felt thick, a constant reminder of the distance that had grown between us. The silence had become a living thing, pressing in on all sides, suffocating me. I knew this wasn't a moment that could be ignored. Something had to change. I could feel the weight of the kiss with Rick still clinging to me, but the guilt had transformed into something else. Clarity. It wasn't just about seeking comfort or filling a void, it was about facing the truth. And the truth was that this relationship, this life we had built, was over. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing that if I took one more step, I couldn't turn back. I stood up, my hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the certainty that had settled over me. I had to let go of the illusions. I had to stop pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. John glanced up from his phone, sensing the shift in the room, but still he didn't understand. He never did. "What's wrong?" he asked, the words flat as though they were an afterthought. The truth hit me like a physical blow. He didn't even care enough to notice that I had changed, that I had been breaking inside for so long. "I can't do this anymore, John," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. The words felt both freeing and terrifying. "We're not the same people we used to be. I'm not the same person I used to be, and neither are you." His face twisted in confusion, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean? I don't—" I cut him off, the words coming faster now, as if I had been holding them back for too long. "I mean that we're stuck. We've been stuck for a long time. And I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not. I don't know when it happened, but we're no longer a couple. We haven't been for months, and I've tried to ignore it, but I can't anymore." The room seemed to close in around us, and I saw a flicker of realization cross his face, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. "I don't even recognize us anymore," I continued, my voice breaking with the weight of what I was admitting. "I don't recognize myself. I've lost so much of who I was while trying to hold on to this thing between us, this illusion. But I can't do it. Not anymore." John's eyes searched mine, and I saw something in them. Shock, confusion, but also a kind of resignation. He had known, deep down, that this was coming. Maybe he'd been waiting for it to happen, or maybe he just didn't have the energy to fight for it anymore. Either way, it didn't matter. "I'm sorry," I whispered, even though I wasn't sure if I was sorry for him, for us, or for myself. I wasn't even sure what I was apologizing for anymore. But the words were all I could offer in the face of this final, unspoken truth. He didn't answer. He just looked at me, his face unreadable before turning back to his phone. I could hear the soft tapping of the screen as he scrolled mindlessly, and it felt like a metaphor for everything we had become, just two people living parallel lives, no longer connected. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, and then, quietly, I turned and walked toward the door. The cold air outside hit me the moment I stepped through the door, and I felt it pierce right through me. The silence of the apartment, the suffocating weight of the past, all seemed to be locked inside those walls now, and as I walked down the street, I felt a sense of release. It wasn't freedom yet, it was too raw, too fresh, but it was the first step toward something else. I didn't know where I was headed, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. I didn't need to be someone else's reflection of happiness or love. I could be just me. And as terrifying as it was, that realization settled over me like a blanket, a quiet comfort in its simplicity. The apartment was waiting for me, empty and still, but this time, it felt different. I had taken the first step toward moving forward, away from the life I'd been holding on to out of habit, out of fear. I knew now that I had to let go of the past, of John, of the apartment, of everything that no longer served me. When I walked in, I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, just breathing. The place was as it always had been, but it felt unfamiliar, like it no longer belonged to me. There were still reminders of our life together, the framed photos, the mismatched furniture we had carefully chosen, the trinkets that had somehow come to symbolize us, but none of it mattered anymore. I was standing on my own now, no longer tethered to the past. I walked to the closet and started pulling out the things I no longer wanted, old shirts, random objects that reminded me of times that were long gone. It wasn't just about cleaning out the space. It was about cleaning out the remnants of a life that had stopped being mine long ago. And as I threw the things into boxes, a strange sense of peace washed over me. It wasn't a loud, dramatic peace. It was soft, like a whisper, but it was there.